Kite Man. Hell yeah. If you've been reading Tom King's run on Batman under DC Rebirth, then this line should sound familiar to you. An iconic catchphrase for a recurring punchline villain, Tom King has inserted the gliding villain of Gotham into several of his Batman issues. But in issue 25 of Batman, writer Tom King relates a grand story arc that details a young Batman still fresh in his fight against crime. This story arc is known as the War of Jokes and Riddles. But even in this landmark Batman story, Tom King still gives us the character of Kite Man, but this time with a new depth and dimension that not only makes the villain more human, but also more meaningful in what he dubs the Ballad of Kite Man. The tone and themes of this arc give new light to most all of Tom King's run on Batman, from the first Rebirth issue to the most recent 50th issue. And so I find it worth discussing the philosophy that turns Kite Man into a hero, an absurd hero. Amongst the action and chaos of the War of Jokes and Riddles, the Ballad of Kite Man starts off by following the character of Charles Brown, a Gotham City areologist that gets thrown into the central conflict when Batman realizes that Charles can be an asset to him. Knowing that Charles has helped the Joker construct his Joker-mobile in the past, Batman intimidates the innocent man into contacting the Joker for him as a mole. Naturally fearing for his life, Charles Brown sets up a meeting with the Joker, a meeting that just so happens to come between him and his only son's birthday. Later, the Riddler finds out about Charles' appointment with the Clown Prince of Crime, and so he threatens Charles with his own son's life to reveal the details about the plan to meet with the Joker. When the day of the meeting comes, it seems as though all of Gotham is in chaos as the three warring factions of the city fight it out while the Joker hauls Charles Brown away. Embarrassed and terrified, Charles immediately confesses to his betrayal to the Joker, and the comedian seems to take some pity on the man, as he says that the whole thing is almost funny. Back at home, Charles receives a phone call from the Riddler, revealing that the villain had murdered the man's son out of vengeance, and the outcome leaves Charles both heartbroken and pensive. On a night home alone, Charles puts his knowledge of wind currents and aerodynamics to use as he constructs a glider and a suit. The next day, he knocks on the Joker's door, introducing himself as Kite Man, hell yeah, and is ready to fight in the War of Jokes and Riddles as a soldier of the Joker. Now that he's at the front line of the action, Kite Man is faced with defeat after defeat with every assignment he's given now that the Batman and the Riddler have formed an alliance to defeat the Joker. Not only taking beatings from Riddler's men and Batman himself, but also from the Joker when the madman hears of each loss. But despite every brutal knockdown he faces, the heartbroken man still manages to get up and keep fighting in the war. Once the Riddler and the Batman capture all of Joker's men, Kite Man is left alone, until he himself is captured, and is left to reveal the final hiding spot of the Joker. While this isn't where the War of Jokes and Riddles ends, this is where the Ballad of Kite Man does, and so from here, we'll be moving on. With these two mere issues, Tom King definitely goes out of his way to decompress the central action of the War of Jokes and Riddles by providing a captivating bystander narrative. But while I've only glossed over the critical events of the Ballad of Kite Man, readers of these two issues may be raising some eyebrows as to why I've neglected what may possibly be considered the most impactful aspect of Kite Man's story: his internal monologue. Particularly in the latter half of the Ballad of Kite Man, we find Tom King using some very specific language to describe Kite Man's circumstances. In the second half of the Ballad of Kite Man, our protagonist goes about the entire issue recalling a conversation he had with his son before his death at the hands of the Riddler. During the dialogue, little Charlie Jr. asks why he heard his mother call his father a joke. After stumbling over his words a bit, Kite Man responds to his son by admitting to the idea that he is in fact a joke, but follows it up by saying that it's not a bad thing. To explain, Kite Man tells the story of a man who is forced to roll a boulder up a mountain, only to have it roll back down immediately after it reaches the top. Now this man is very clearly a joke. But in order to keep going and go on with his life, the man has to laugh at himself and the situation. Now those of you who may be well versed in Greek mythology may recognize this story as the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a man who was cursed by the Greek gods to haul a boulder up a mountain, only to have it roll back down once he has achieved his task. Getting this boulder up the mountain is Sisyphus' only task. It's his punishment and his torment. He is given nothing else to live for. The myth was originally meant to be a story of divine wrath and punishment for a man that the gods had felt deserved such a meaningless fate. But Kite Man's solution to Sisyphus' plight, as well as his own plight as a joke, invokes a branch of existential philosophy popularized by the mid-20th century French philosopher Albert Camus, the philosophy of absurdism. In his aptly named essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus not only recounts the legend of Sisyphus' punishment in a manner similar to Kite Man, but also details the larger themes and ideas that plague not only Sisyphus, but all of humanity in the modern era. According to Camus, mankind naturally suffers from a rift between their innate desire to rationalize and find meaning in the universe, and the chaotic indifference that the universe has towards mankind. Camus refers to this rift as the absurd, and it serves as the basis of the existential plight in his philosophy. As Camus puts it, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Now, being an existentialist, Camus very clearly saw the absurd as something to be in anguish over. It presents a sort of existential dread that can make any person feel small or insignificant, so much that it leads to the realization that the world is meaningless. According to Camus, once a person has become conscious of the absurd, they can't turn back to their life of blissful ignorance. For Camus, the absurdity of the world can make any task feel meaningless, which is why he alludes to the myth of Sisyphus, who he calls an absurd hero. Because, instead of having to endure the torment of the absurd as if it were some punishment, Camus proposes that we, as well as Sisyphus, rebel against the absurdity of the world by trying to make our own meaning and happiness. His essay ends with his most famous line, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Because if he can still find a way to be happy in a state of torment, then so can we. This is the core philosophy of absurdism. The world may not have meaning, but it doesn't mean we can't be happy in it. Through the philosophy of absurdism, we can see the Ballad of Kite Man, as well as the War of Jokes and Riddles, and all of Tom King's run in a new light. Kite Man's reference and solution to the legend of Sisyphus is a direct reference to Camus' solution to the plight of the absurd. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, or as Tom King says, one must imagine Kite Man laughing. Just as the happiness that we and Sisyphus can find rebels against the absurdity of the world, one could say that Kite Man becomes an absurd hero when he rebels against the absurdity of his world with every hell yeah he gives. In Camus' words, happiness and the absurd are two sons of the same earth. They are inseparable. But let's talk a little more about that, the absurdity of Kite Man's world. As Camus says, the absurd arises from the schism between the innate human desire to rationalize the world and the natural state of chaos that the world exists in. I don't know about you, but I see the absurd manifest itself in Gotham through the War of Jokes and Riddles itself. The conflict between the logical and rationalist Riddler and the lunatic and unpredictable Joker. Through this interpretation, it's not only Kite Man who suffers from the absurd, but also Batman. While Batman doesn't exactly suffer from the absurd like Kite Man through humiliating defeats, he does still endure his life as a vigilante and grapples with the question of whether or not he should continue being so unhappy. He takes on the Sisyphean task of trying to rid Gotham of crime and corruption, a task that seems just as absurd as trying to roll a boulder up a mountain. In Tom King's Rebirth issue of Batman, we see him discuss the absurdity of this never-ending task of saving Gotham. But King establishes that Batman will never stop trying despite its futility. And as of the date of this video, years later after this Rebirth issue, We see Tom King return to the question of Batman's absurd dilemma with Batman number 50, when Bruce Wayne asks Alfred if he can be happy, to which Alfred replies, in a style reminiscent of Camus, "Don't you have to be?" In the philosophy of absurdism, life is full of senseless chaos. But despite the tragedies that may come and go, we must always get back up and go on with our lives. In Camus' words, living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is, above all, contemplating it. The absurd dies only when we turn away from it. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. That revolt gives life its value. That discipline that the mind imposes on itself, that will conjured up out of nothing, that face-to-face struggle, have something exceptional about them. For hope and inspiration, we can always turn to myths, both ancient and modern. One must imagine Sisyphus, or Kite Man, or even Batman, happy.